Easter Sunday, 1478. The massive dome of the Santa Maria del Fiore Cathedral in Florence is packed with thousands of worshippers, the air heavy with the sweet, cloying scent of incense and the echoing, ethereal chants of the choir. At the high altar, two brothers stand at the center of the world, Lorenzo and Giuliano de' Medici. They are the unofficial kings of the Florentine Republic, men whose immense wealth has built the very walls around them and commissioned the masterpieces that decorate their city. As the priest raises the silver chalice for the elevation of the host, the most sacred, silent moment of the Mass, the great bell of the Duomo tolls. But today, it isn't a call to prayer. It is a signal for cold-blooded murder. In a flash of steel, priests and noblemen who had been kneeling in pious prayer rise with daggers hidden beneath their heavy silk robes. Giuliano is struck first, his body pierced 19 times in a frenzied attack, until he collapses in a pool of blood on the cold marble floor. Lorenzo, wounded in the neck but miraculously alive, leaps over the altar rail and fights his way into the sacristy, slamming the heavy bronze doors just as the assassin's blades scrape against the metal. This was the Pazzi Conspiracy, a desperate, bloody attempt to decapitate a dynasty. But it was also the moment the golden mask of the Renaissance slipped, revealing the jagged, bone-deep power struggle that lay beneath the art, the philosophy, and the beauty. In this investigation, we are going behind the frescoed walls of the Palazzo Medici to uncover the shadow monarchy of Florence. We will explore how a family of middle-class money changers used debt, propaganda, and strategic violence to hijack a republic and turn it into their private bank account. We will look at the secret ledger books that funded the Renaissance and the brutal machinery of surveillance they used to keep their rivals in check. We're going to reconstruct the Pazzi Conspiracy not just as a murder, but as a failed corporate takeover backed by the highest office in the world, the papacy. If you're into stories that peel back the layers of legendary dynasties to find the gritty, Machiavellian reality beneath, you've found the right place. We are diving into the blood and the gold of the Medici. If you're fascinated by the moments where money and murder collide to change the course of history, make sure to subscribe so you can join us for our next investigation into the dark side of power. To understand how the Medici became the most powerful family in Europe, you have to understand that they were the first modern masters of the invisible throne. Florence was a republic, a city fiercely proud of its independence and its lack of a king. For the Florentines, the memory of ancient Roman liberty was a religion. To openly claim power was to invite immediate exile or a public execution. The Medici genius, starting with Cosimo the Elder in the early 1400s, was to rule without ever appearing to rule. They didn't hold the major offices of the state, they simply owned the people who did. By creating a sprawling international bank with branches from London to Rome, the Medici made themselves the creditors of the world. They realized early on that a man who owes you money is a man you control. If a politician in Florence wanted to keep his villa, or a cardinal in Rome wanted to fund a war, they had to go through the Medici. Debt was their primary weapon. It was a silent, bloodless coup that replaced the sword with the ledger, and it was devastatingly effective. But there is a detail here that changes everything. Cosimo the Elder was once arrested and nearly executed by his rivals, the Albizzi family. He spent weeks in a tiny cell at the top of the government tower, hearing the bells toll and wondering if his next meal would be poisoned. He survived only because he managed to bribe his jailers with Medici gold. When he returned from his brief exile, he didn't return as a conqueror. He returned as a citizen. He lived in a house that looked modest from the outside. He walked the streets without bodyguards, and he spoke softly in the councils. But behind that modesty was a man who had perfected the art of the puppet master. He manipulated the tax codes to bankrupt his enemies and used the Monte delle Doti, the city's dowry fund, to make the entire Florentine elite dependent on his bank. He was the first to realize that you don't need a crown if you hold the keys to the treasury. But here is what most people miss about the early Medici. They were masters of soft power long before the term was ever coined. They didn't just spend money, they invested in the very image of the city. When you see the works of Donatello or Brunelleschi, you aren't just looking at timeless art, you are looking at sophisticated Medici propaganda. Every statue, every church facade, and every public festival was a carefully calibrated message designed to tell the people of Florence that their prosperity and their glory were inseparable from the Medici family. Take, for example, the Adoration of the Magi fresco in their private chapel. It depicts the biblical journey of the three kings, but if you look closer, the kings are actually portraits of the Medici themselves, dressed in gold and followed by a crowd of their real-world supporters. They were literally painting themselves into the sacred history of the world. They were the godfathers of the Renaissance, but that title carried a heavy price. Behind the scenes, they maintained a network of spies and informants that would have made a modern intelligence agency proud. They knew who was talking to their rivals in Milan, who was struggling to pay their taxes, and who was ripe for a bribe. They turned the beautiful city of Florence into a gilded cage where everyone was watched and everyone was on the payroll. The Pazzi Conspiracy of 1478 was the inevitable explosion of decades of this pent-up resentment. The Pazzi were an older, more aristocratic family who viewed the Medici as new money upstarts, vulgar bankers who had bought their way into a society where they didn't belong. But the Pazzi weren't acting alone. The investigation into the plot reveals a web of conspiracy that reached all the way to the heart of the Vatican. Pope Sixtus IV wanted to expand the Papal States into territory controlled by Florence, and the Medici, acting as the protectors of the Republic's borders, stood in his way. The Pope couldn't openly order a murder. That would be unseemly for the Vicar of Christ. But in a classic, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest" moment, he gave his blessing to the Pazzi to remove the Medici from power. He told them that the papacy would support a change in government, provided it was done without the sin of murder. It was a wink and a nod that gave the conspirators all the cover they needed. The plot involved the Archbishop of Pisa, the Duke of Urbino, and a professional mercenary captain named Montesecco. It was a multi-state operation designed to wipe out the Medici line in a single, coordinated strike. But here is where the story takes a dark, almost cinematic turn. The original plan was to kill the brothers at a banquet the night before, but Giuliano was feeling unwell and stayed home. The conspirators, fearing the plot would leak if they waited another day, decided to move the hit to the Duomo during Easter Mass. This presented a problem for the professional soldier Montesecco. He was a hardened killer, but even he balked at the idea of committing sacrilege by murdering men at the high altar in front of the consecrated host. He backed out at the last minute. Desperate, the Pazzi replaced him with 2 priests. They figured that if anyone was comfortable being at the altar during Mass, it was a priest. But these men were amateurs with the blade. When the signal came, the ringing of the bell, they fumbled. They managed to kill Giuliano, who was unarmed and defenseless, but they only grazed Lorenzo. That small mistake changed the course of European history. The conspirators made a second, even more fatal error. They fundamentally underestimated the power of the Medici brand. After the bloodbath in the cathedral, Francesco de Pazzi and the Archbishop of Pisa ran into the streets, covered in blood, shouting liberty and "The Republic is free." They expected the people of Florence, whom they believed were oppressed by the Medici, to rise up and join them in a glorious revolution. Instead, the people rose up against them. The Florentines didn't want the liberty offered by a group of aristocratic assassins and foreign mercenaries. They wanted the stability the festivals, and the wealth provided by the Medici Bank. What followed was a purge of such breathtaking, visceral violence that it sent shockwaves across the continent. The conspirators were hunted through the streets like animals. Francesco de Pazzi, found hiding in his bed, was dragged naked through the city and hung from a window of the Palazzo Vecchio. The Archbishop of Pisa was hung right next to him, still wearing his full clerical robes. Legend says that in his final, desperate moments, the Archbishop sunk his teeth into the shoulder of another hanging conspirator, dying with his jaws locked in a grip of pure hate. Lorenzo de' Medici, now known as the Magnificent, emerged from the blood of the cathedral as an absolute ruler in all but name. He used the failed coup to consolidate his power, stripping the remaining rival families of their wealth and rights. But the machinery of power he inherited was starting to rust. The Medici Bank, the very source of their strength, was beginning to fail due to a toxic combination of mismanagement, high living, and a string of bad loans to European kings who had no intention of ever paying them back. Lorenzo realized that if he couldn't maintain his power through the ledger, he had to maintain it through sheer force of will and diplomatic genius. He became the needle of the balance in Italy, playing the warring city-states of Venice, Milan, and Naples against each other to ensure that no one became strong enough to challenge Florence. He was a poet, a patron, and a master politician, but he was also a haunted man who had to watch his back every second of every day, knowing that the Pope had placed his entire city under interdict and was actively trying to destroy him. But here's what most people miss about Lorenzo's greatest gamble. With a papal army marching on Florence and the city facing starvation, Lorenzo did the unthinkable. He traveled alone to Naples, the territory of his most dangerous enemy, King Ferrante. Ferrante was a man known for his cruelty. He famously had his enemies mummified and kept them in a museum so he could dine with them. Lorenzo walked into this lion's den with nothing but his wits. He convinced the king that a strong Medici Florence was better for the balance of Italy than a dominant pope. It was a masterclass in diplomacy that saved the city, but it also solidified the idea that the Medici were the state. There was no longer any pretense of a republic. Lorenzo was the prince, and Florence was his principality. This is where the narrative takes a dark religious turn that the Medici never saw coming. As the family's power grew more ostentatious and their court more pagan, a voice began to rise from the streets that challenged the very foundation of their rule. Girolamo Savonarola, a fanatical Dominican friar with a voice like thunder, began preaching to massive crowds in the Duomo, the very place where Giuliano had been murdered. He claimed that the Medici had turned Florence into a new Babylon, a city of sin, greed, and vanity. He claimed that the Renaissance itself was an affront to God. Savonarola wasn't just a religious extremist. He was a populist revolutionary who tapped into the growing economic gap between the ultra-wealthy Medici circle and the struggling working class. He called for a bonfire of the vanities, where the people would burn their jewelry, their fine clothes, and even the lewd paintings commissioned by the Medicis. He represented the anti-Renaissance, a primal scream of medieval traditionalism against the secular humanistic world the Medici had built. When Lorenzo the Magnificent died in 1492, the same pivotal year Columbus reached the Americas, the Medici machinery collapsed almost overnight. His son, Piero the Unlucky, lacked his father's diplomatic touch and his grandfather's financial sense. When the French army invaded Italy, Piero panicked and surrendered the city's fortresses without a fight. The Florentines, fueled by Savonarola's rhetoric, finally snapped. The Medici were declared enemies of the state and driven into exile. Their magnificent palace was looted, their art was scattered, and for a few years, Florence became a fundamentalist theocracy, under Savonarola's thumb. But here is the investigative twist that most history books gloss over. The Medici didn't just disappear into the shadows. They had spent decades playing a much longer game. They had placed family members in high positions within the Catholic Church, effectively diversifying their power portfolio. They shifted their strategy from being the bankers of the Pope to being the popes. The early 16th century saw the rise of two Medici popes, Leo X and Clement VII. These were not men of God. They were men of the Medici. They used the vast spiritual and financial resources of the papacy to fund the reconquest of their hometown. They were no longer interested in the invisible throne or the polite fictions of a republic. When they finally returned to Florence, they didn't come with bribes. They came with battle-hardened Spanish armies and heavy artillery. They crushed the last remnants of Florentine democracy in a brutal siege and established themselves as the hereditary Grand Dukes of Tuscany. The transition was finally complete. The family of middle-class money changers had successfully transformed themselves into a royal dynasty that would rule for another 200 years. They had traded the messy, dangerous world of Republican politics for the absolute, divinely sanctioned power of a crown. They moved out of their modest family home and into the Pitti Palace, a fortress-like residence that screamed of their absolute authority. However, there is a lingering hypothesis among some historians that the Medici's greatest achievement, the Renaissance itself, was actually the seed of their own eventual undoing. By funding the study of ancient Greek and Roman texts, they inadvertently rediscovered the very republican and democratic ideals that would eventually lead to the rise of the Enlightenment and the fall of absolute monarchies. They built the great libraries that taught people how to think for themselves, and they funded the art that humanized the world, making it harder for any one family to claim a God-given right to rule over everyone else. They were the architects of a modern world that they could not ultimately control. They created the light that would eventually expose the shadows of their own tyranny. The story of the Medici is a masterclass in how power is not just seized, but meticulously manufactured. They understood that to control a city, you must control its money, its leaders, and its very soul. They proved that beauty and blood are often two sides of the same coin, and that the greatest monuments of human achievement are frequently built on a foundation of betrayal, debt, and calculated violence. They left behind a city that is still to this day a magnificent museum to their collective ego. But they also left a chilling warning about what happens when a single family becomes too big for the state to contain. They showed the world that a bank can be more powerful than an army, and a painting can be more effective than a law. The Medici legacy is not just the David or the birth of Venus. It is the realization that power is, and always has been, a performance. From the humble banking counters of Cosimo to the gilded papal throne of Leo X, they played their roles with a terrifying, brilliant precision. They showed us that an empire doesn't always need a crown to be absolute. Sometimes all it needs is a long memory, a vast fortune, and a very sharp dagger hidden in the right place. As you walk through the streets of Florence today, looking up at the statues they commissioned and the domes they built, remember that every one of them was paid for with the kind of money that usually comes with a body count. The Renaissance wasn't just a rebirth of art. It was a sophisticated rebranding of power that still influences how we see leadership and wealth in the modern world. Who are the Medici of our modern era, and whose bonfire are we currently preparing to light? That is the question the shadows of Florence still ask us today. If this look into the shadow monarchy of the Medici and the blood-soaked streets of Renaissance Florence changed how you see the godfathers of the Renaissance, make sure to subscribe so you can join us as we continue to investigate the dark history of the world's most powerful dynasties.